Okay, so thank you so much for everyone for coming along for tonight's event. Thank you to our attendees, and thank you most importantly to our lovely community champions who are all here. So what I will ask initially, just before going into introductions and talking about the format of tonight, is if all Progress and Dialogue directors, barring myself as facilitator, can turn off your cameras. That way we can focus in on community champions. Perfect, thank you. So yeah, tonight is really about having a conversation. This isn't a traditional panel discussion. It's not looking to have any specific agenda. What tonight is about learning from lived experience, and hopefully from the community champions as well. Maybe getting a bit of an insight as well to what it's like to live as a trans person, and some of the issues and the challenges, and how all of us, the attendees and the non-trans community members who are present tonight, can actually help get rid of some of that inequality and help get rid of those challenges, because the impetus is not on trans people, right? This is an issue which we'll go into, I'm sure, and I'm sure I'm looking at some of the champions and I know they'll go into this, but this is an issue for non-trans people to make sure we get rid of in society. Transphobia is not something we should still have in 2020. It's something we should never have had. So I just want to start tonight's conversation with that. I will explain briefly about the format of tonight's conversation. So I mentioned briefly to attendees, you won't be able to see yourself or hear yourself, but what we would ask is if there's any questions that come up that you'd like to ask to our community champions, if you can submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and myself or one of my colleagues will feed that into the discussion when the time is right, so that we can organically have a conversation. We'd also ask that follow the event online and feel free to tweet, and feel free to, share on social media how you feel about the event, and hopefully you will enjoy that. The last thing I would like to share before handing over to our community champions is that this is a safe space. So our safe space policy has been shared on our social media. Community champions have given up their time to be with us tonight. So please show respect in what you ask. We do say that any question is important, and we're here to really have a conversation and to challenge prejudice, to challenge misinformation, maybe assumption as well. But that any outright hatred or rude messages or any of that will not be tolerated, and we will remove you from tonight's event. Apologies for the technical difficulties there. So without any further ado, I'd like to pass over to introductions. So what we say with these events is it shouldn't be my voice, but the community champions' voices. So we allow it up to 10 minutes for each community champion to introduce themselves. Of course, you don't have to use all of that time. Some people like to talk more than others, but please, yeah, if anyone would like to go first, otherwise I'm happy to pick people as well. But just if you could introduce yourself and tell the attendees who you are and kind of a little bit of background as well. Anyone want to go first?
Yeah, I'm gonna go first again. I'm seeing feedback. Are you hearing that as well?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Right, so my name is Lisa. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm non-binary, more specifically agender, the term I use. And the reason I wanted to take part tonight is because I think it's really important that we have conversations. So a lot of the time when I'm speaking to cis people, so non-trans people, about being trans, I end up doing a lot of education. So I have to explain a lot of terminology and basic concepts and answer a lot of questions. And usually it takes a while to be able to get into sort of to get more in depth in conversations. And I think this is a really great opportunity for us to have a conversation among trans people to be able to go in depth, and for cis people to be able to listen in and kind of listen in on that. When I was in university, I founded and ran a program called Your Queer Best Friend, which is a mentoring program where we match up people who are sort of out and proud with other people who are struggling with our identity or with questions around being queer in whatever way, shape, or form. And I founded this program because I noticed that a lot of people were finding their way into the community through friends who were queer, who would like bring them along to events and things. And if you don't already have those connections, it can be really difficult to kind of find your way in. And I was hoping that this program would provide that kind of way in for people. And I think that's kind of analogous to what this event tonight's all about. For anyone who might not know of any out trans people in their life that they can talk to, that they can learn from, to have access basically to people with lived experience, and to learn from that through dialogue, which is the purpose of Progress and Dialogue as an organization.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and that's exactly it. That's what we're hoping from tonight. People do gain is that this is a safe space so that we can develop together as a society, but that, you know, it's a platform for voices which are seldom heard. So I'm really, really glad that we have you along tonight. I think it might be easier if I just ask people to introduce rather than giving volunteers, despite the very courageous voluntary action by Lisa there. Rue, you're next on my screen. Perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself next.
Hello, I'm Rue. I use he or they pronouns, and I identify as a non-binary trans man. I am a Welsh Romani person, but I have been raised and lived in the US my entire life, so I live in Oregon. And it's really exciting for me to be part of this conversation, because I think another issue that we have with marginalized communities is that they can feel very insular, because I'm a trans person in the US and everyone else on this panel is a trans person in the UK, and our communities face similar and different struggles in those respective countries. So what Progress and Dialogue is doing with having champions worldwide and getting to have conversations with people working in marginalized communities elsewhere is really exciting to me, because it's an outlook that I don't normally get to have. I've been working as an activist for the LGBT+ community since high school, when I was championing our QSA at school, and I worked to get gender neutral bathrooms and a gender neutral policy for graduation in place. And then at university, I worked with our queer center on campus, which was an outreach center for people who were in crisis and members of the community. And I think it's really important to really get to talk to people who are like yourself, because a lot of what Lisa said, where if you're talking to a cis person about being trans, they're not ever going to if you have to explain the basics every time, the basics are all that cis people know. And I think getting to experience the intricacies of the trans experience is a lot more educating than just being told over and over again, these people are trans.
Thanks, Rue. Thanks for that introduction. And again, thank you so much for joining us all the way from the US as well. And it's really important that we do acknowledge that, you know, the trans community doesn't have borders, right? You know, it's an international community, and it's crucial to have your voice in that as well. So thanks for joining us, Rue. Emma, would you like to go next? You're next on my screen.
Yeah, I'll go. So I'm Emma. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a binary trans woman. Some days when I'm not in these kind of conversations, I just refer to myself as a woman. I've been an activist now for about 16 years. Worked quite a long time doing in England with councils and health boards generally. and then run a trans support group down in Lancaster. Moved back up to Scotland, and I've followed the same kind of path. Worked with LGBT youth on trans youth groups, which I thought was fabulous. You know, just seeing all the young people, and I guess getting a bit jealous, like, why could I not have transitioned so much sooner than I did? And you know, think it's really great that kids have the space now to be able to do that at that young age. Done a bit of work with Scottish Trans as well. A lot of it's been going into universities, colleges, and other organisations doing like trans awareness. Sometimes that's like a general hour session where it literally is just like a trans 101. But sometimes organisations, you know, put a lot more into it, and they'll book you for like a half-day training where you can get a bit more in-depth into some of the different issues that go on. And then more latterly, I got involved in Scottish politics, mainly around the lack of trans representation in politics and trying to drive that forward. Now that's me.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks. And Teddy, would you like to go next? Oh, you're muted, Teddy.
Can you hear me now? Right, it's like that American advert. But yeah, I'm Teddy Hope, pronouns they, them. I'm the trans officer from Out for Independence, which is the LGBT wing of the SNP. So I've been into trans activism for quite recently, actually. I used to do a lot of, I did some activism for working class youth quite a few years ago. But really what made me get into it was, I was a PhD researcher, and I still am, to see the whole demographic change in recent years, particularly with the trans tipping point in 2013 and 14. Like, we saw this massive increase in the visibility of what is still a quite small community. We're like 0.6% of the population, but we're like put front and center. And I think it really kind of like radicalized me in the sense I was seeing the actual difficulty where like visibility isn't necessarily the same as equality. We've seen this hyper visibility has actually been accompanied by this increased levels of violence towards trans women of color, and like just general like melee of horribleness that's occurred in the recent years. And I think I just really wanted to kind of see what I can do in my community to kind of reach out. But I think like a lot of people, like I think that was the first bit of it, but then I realized, you know, there's a lot of issues affecting trans people beyond just horribleness in the media. There's actually healthcare issues, there's issues of intimate violence with partners, and I just felt like, you know, this is actually, you know, part of my life, but part of my lives of my own community, and I really want to reach out and help others. So I think when I did a wee session with Stonewall a few years back, I was at it was actually an all trans event for young trans people to kind of learn activism, and it was like an all trans safe space. And I was like 24 at the time, which is quite late, but it was my first time just around only trans people, and I've just never been like that before, and I've never actually encountered that many trans people in one room. So I think it's just so wonderful to kind of create spaces where you can actually interrelate our own experiences and actually create a dialogue and move forward with that. So I'm excited to contribute today.
Thanks so much for joining, Teddy. Thanks, and I'm sure that's exactly what will happen today, and I'm excited as well. So lastly then we have Luke. Luke, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, I'll try. So I'm Luke, I go by he, him pronouns. I'm a trans guy, but when people ask me how I identify, I don't usually say I identify as a trans guy, I just identify as a man. Obviously I am trans and I'm like proud of that and out, and yeah, but I kind of have some different views, I guess, to most trans people. I'm like the least trans guy. But I still feel that, you know, even though I don't so much tell people, I feel like I still have some important views and opinions, and I want my voice to be heard, hence why I'm here. And I think it's a great idea to have this kind of conversation like platform, rather than having, you know, like reading a story or seeing a story or hearing something about it and just hearing about trans things. I think it's a good opportunity for people to talk not so much to cis people or at them or anything like that, just more kind of between each other and being able to just speak freely, I guess. I've also not really done any trans activism things. This is the first thing I've been a part of, although I'm a scout leader as well, so I like to kind of encourage the kids to be themselves and everything like that, but I've not really done anything in the way of activism, I guess, so it's a good stepping stone.
Definitely, totally, and thank you so much for that, Luke. And that's exactly what this platform is about, right? It's about hearing grassroots voices from communities. You don't have to be an experienced activist to have an important voice. That's what we believe at Progress and Dialogue. So no, we're really, really glad to have you here, Luke. Okay, so now everyone's had a chance to briefly introduce themselves. The way the format of these events work, if you haven't been to our Conversation for Change before, is round about the first hour, or well, perhaps not hour now, but the first little while will be spent asking co-designed questions to our lovely community champions around issues which matter to them and things that they would like to discuss. During that time, again, please feel free to send in your questions to the Q&A box. And what we do is, for the last period of time before culminating the event, we ask those questions to our community champions as well. So the first question that I have here is, again, quite a general one, but what do you think are the main challenges facing trans people today? And again, any of our community activists can jump in at any time for this. Teddy, yeah?
Let me just, start. I think there are a lot of issues affecting trans people on multiple levels. First off, I think the big elephant in the room when we talk about like issues surrounding trans people, there's a horrific level of public discussion regarding trans people, and it's a lot of like basically scare stories brought about in the UK press. Like, it's a very UK-specific phenomenon that's probably started, like a lot of it was arguably with the GRA announcements to reform the Gender Recognition Act, which was a simple process just to just fiddle around with simplifying the process you go through for updating your birth certificate to match the gender to which you identify. But it then got into all these wider discussions about bathrooms and like rape crisis centers, refugees, basically about the participation of trans women in public life. That is now under dispute. And to be honest, like, these laws have already been in play for a very long time. And this is why I think, and it's also been enshrined in the Equality Act 2010, was to protect trans women's access to single-sex spaces based on gender reassignment. So that's certainly one big issue which galvanizes a lot of energy. And I think as a trans person, I always feel it's quite sad going online and seeing everyone talk about all these kind of scare stories, when I think the other stuff is like, we're being draining all of our energy towards this, when also there's a healthcare crisis going on. Like, the current healthcare system for trans people is completely destroyed. It's not working. We have horrifically long wait times, and it desperately needs reform. And like, once again, as I was saying before, like, we're also in the middle of COVID-19, where we're basically kind of isolated in the private sphere with our partners who might be abusive. So there's a particularly higher rates of domestic abuse towards trans feminine people than per se their cisgender counterparts. So that's another big concern. Another issue here is also just patriarchal male violence. And another thing which I find deeply, deeply harrowing is this discussion of like the abuse of, well, basically conversion therapy for young trans people is being very publicly advocated in the public sphere and normalized as part of this big wide discussion. And I think that for me is the stuff that I feel is just like, okay, we need to cut down this, that's not okay. But I think that's just a couple of issues we're facing.
Yeah, I think in all of these points are need really big issues with it for trans people. And I think sometimes I'll have an experience at work where my colleagues will use the right pronouns without like getting it wrong or things like that, or like go out of their way to like make sure that I have access to a bathroom or something like that. And I'll feel so grateful for that. And sometimes I think, wow, that's depressing that things that should be the absolute baseline feel like a victory because of how bad a lot of the other how a lot of the problems are. And I think anyone who's marginalized in any way will recognize that feeling of being grateful for small things that we really shouldn't have to be fighting for and having to be grateful for. And I think specifically as a non-binary person, on top of, I think at this point, we've gotten to the point where pretty much everyone knows what a trans man or a trans woman is, even though they often say the wrong way around. And so even if there isn't acceptance or inclusion or anything, at least people know what it is, know what it means. Whereas I spent so much of my time having to basically explain the fact that I exist. And that is also incredibly emotionally draining. And in every interaction I have with a new person, I have to weigh, like, are they going to understand this? Am I going to have to educate them? Can I do that safely? Do I have the energy for that? Is that going to be a very long, difficult discussion? Are they going to remember my pronouns? How are they reading me? Like, what do they think I am, like, before the conversation? All of those things are specifically for non-binary people are a big issue, and it's not something that we can solve by getting the bathroom bill revoked or things like that. It's a cultural change that needs to happen, and it's a lifetime or two possibly. Yeah.
I think like another thing personally for me is that a lot of the time people the general public tends to ignore that trans people can also be other marginalized identities as well. And so like trans people of color, like trans women of color especially, or trans feminine people of color, or just any trans person who's also disabled or a person of color or a member of a marginalized community, their issues are very like separated. Like, oh, you can only have like thoughts on this issue because you're trans. You can't weigh in on a different thing at the same time, and you can't talk about how your different like marginalizations overlap and how they affect each other. And I think a lot of the time, like, it's really frustrating to exist in a space and have to choose, like, oh, am I going to advocate for myself as a trans person, or am I going to advocate for myself as a Romani person or a disabled person in this space? And like, how many of those things do I have the time and energy to talk about and educate you about if like if the person you're talking to isn't already up to date on any of those issues? And because so much of the world we live in isn't willing to educate on those issues culturally, and it puts it up to trans people or up to other marginalized folks, it just can get very exhausting to have to sit and explain every aspect of my identity to someone just to feel like I am a person.
Yeah, I think picking up on what some of the other ones have said already, I mean, I feel a bit strained about this, because I came out 16 years ago and I pretty much had a quiet time. I've been quite fortunate. I guess most people would see me as cis-passing, which basically means I don't often get read as a trans person. I might be read more once I decide to bellow my voice across the room, but generally walking about society, people don't bother about me. So I've spent most of the last 16 years just getting on with my life, using women's spaces and everything else, just being accepted as a woman in society. And all of a sudden, over the last 3 years, it's like, what's going on? Where did this come from? I was just kind of jogging along, gradually campaigning to get better rights, and all of a sudden there's this whole massive backlash, and it's pretty scary, really thinking about, as others have said, it's like thinking every time you go out the door, are you going to be challenged around your identity? And you know, and I'm disabled as well as trans, but it's literally everywhere you go. Can I go and get involved in a disabled discussion, or are they going to be transphobic towards me? Can I go and join a women's group? Are they going to be transphobic towards me? You know, can I go to a pottery class? Are they going to be transphobic towards me? You know, and it's wrong, but it gets to the point where the safe space you find is just being around other trans people. You know, and that's obviously not what we're looking for, especially because some of us don't live near a lot of other trans people. You know, we need to live in the same world as everybody else, but it just feels like it's becoming more and more difficult.
No, like I think so too. Like, I like one of my biggest issues were like particularly around like gender neutral spaces and all that is, I think for non-binary people, we do also experience, as you know, we tend to be, not exclusively, but tend to be quite gender non-conforming. So we're kind of like treated as almost the other of like certain of, you know, of the binary, so that we kind of dehumanize because we're not even human, we're not male or female, we're actually this other thing that's less than human. So sometimes, like, I remember years ago I was walking home at night. I've got quite long hair, so like from the back, I sometimes guys think I'm a woman from the back, but then they see my face and my beard. So a guy was at a pub and he was drunk and he came over and threw his arm around me while I was waiting to cross the road, and he was like, "Hey darling," and then I kind of turned my head round and then he swamped my beard. He pushed me into the traffic, and like, and I just remember that kind of memory of like, you know, on one hand I'm treated in a misogynistic context of being treated as a sexual object, but then it multiplies with my transness. Like the second I'm read as trans, I'm not even human to be treated as an object to be pulled close. I'm something to be killed, like something to be pushed into nothingness. And I think that's always been something that's stuck with me, is that, you know, like this is the kind of anxiety, like when you're so scared of like that kind of confrontation of being read as not a male or female, it is so scary. Like even the other, like I've also been in situations where I've had to use like rape crisis services, and if I use that service, like I was so afraid, like even just using the hotline, because I'm scared of what will they think when they hear my voice. Like I need to use the service, and like I've even spoken to people who run rape crisis centers, and they're pretty much everyone I know of in Scotland are, you know, trans inclusive and serve non-binary people. But the sheer like just inertia of seeing this big atmosphere of like, you're a predator if you enter this space, hence you're deserving to be hurt, is so heavy. And it's so something that kind of pushes you and stops you from ever like approaching that service when you are kind of suffering and need it. So I think that's the other side of the coin when we discuss trans issues. Like there's particularly around like the whole, like, you know, like this is a woman's issues concern, but like it's a double-sided coin, because we're also constantly being read as predators. And when you're read as a predator, you're read as something that must be harmed. And like I've walked home with bad makeup and I've had glass bottles thrown at me by both men and women, and it's just they don't really know our experiences.
Luke, I don't know if you want to come in on that point as well.
I actually had a completely I feel like I'm breaking up the conversation now, but one of the issues that I'm finding right now actually is just the healthcare system, like trying to get through to different appointments. As I know that right now, obviously with COVID-19, that is difficult and stuff. But one of my issues that I'm finding is it seems to be, there doesn't seem to be any sort of real system. And the only reason I'm realizing it is I know people who have come out 2 years after me and have already had top surgery and have already started hormones and things. And like I've started hormones, I'm still on a waiting list for top surgery. I did have my first appointment over like a Zoom call, but before that, I waited, I think it's almost 3 years now I've been on a waiting list. And I know someone that went on a waiting list, it took 6 months and then they had their top surgery. And I don't understand how there doesn't seem to be an actual sort of system for it. And I know actually a lot of younger people wanting to start hormone blockers and things who are, you know, obviously hitting puberty now and starting to like make changes, who aren't having access to, you know, the things that they need to be comfortable just to even go to school and things like that. Is I think it's a bit crazy right now. And I know that obviously it is good, and we're very privileged to have the NHS and the national healthcare services that we have. But I also think there's a flaw in the system somewhere that needs kind of fixed.
Totally,
Yeah.
totally. And don't worry, look, about breaking up the conversation, because we can always return to subjects as well, and it's just important to get it out in case you forget as well, right? Sorry, Rue, did you want to come in on that?
You're good. Yeah, I mean, I live in the U.S., so our healthcare system isn't public; it's privatized, which has its own slew of difficulties because any private healthcare system can choose to deny trans people access simply because they're trans. Like a lot of healthcare groups in the U.S. are owned by churches or owned by religious groups. And so if your healthcare system happens to be owned by a religious group that doesn't support the existence of trans people, they can deny you not only just trans healthcare, like transition care, but they can deny you basic healthcare as well on the basis of being trans, which makes things difficult. I'm very lucky in that the healthcare that I have is trans inclusive, but there's one gender clinic in my entire state. So if I want to get an appointment, I have to make one with that particular clinic. And at any given point, it's a 6 to 8 month wait essentially to get any appointment with an actual doctor to talk about transitioning.
Yeah, I was thinking that, so like, yeah, we do have the private healthcare option, and we also have the NHS, and we're very obviously lucky to have that. But also, yeah, so for under 18s in Scotland, or I don't know if it's changed now, but as far as I'm aware, there's only Sandyford, which is in Glasgow. And if you live anywhere that's not, Aberdeen or Edinburgh or Glasgow, it's difficult to get there because there's kind of one triangle road around Scotland. So I think there's not a lot of options. And then obviously if you go into that service, it's anyone under 18 goes there. So if you are 17 and 9 months, you'll have your first appointment there, and they'll refer you to an adult service near you. And as far as I'm aware as well, there's one for Grampian area, which is in Aberdeen. And then it might be another year or so waiting list for that service after you've just spent maybe 2 years waiting to get on the first one. So
Can I flip two sides of a coin here? Yeah, it's great we've got the NHS, and I'm probably going to upset every other trans person that's on this panel. I waited 3 months for a first appointment. I had already transitioned before I got there. 3 months, 16 years ago, and now we're looking at 2 or 3 years for a first appointment. I was 3 years, I was finished with the NHS, pretty much, and now people are being expected to wait that long just to get to see a specialist. But I guess on the other side of the NHS, one thing that just came up for me when we were talking was I had to go for a kind of minor revision. So I went to a local GP who then pretty much almost sexually assaulted me if I hadn't stopped her, to get a referral back down to a gender specialist for a minor revision. And I'm just like, you go to a GP, you expect care. She had no idea what she was doing. All she had to do was look up and say, right, I'll refer you back to, it ended up, it was Charing Cross in London I had to go to. But, sometimes it's just that, it's simple things you go to try and get fixed, and it becomes an absolute nightmare. You just, I think for me, you kind of expect a bad result when you go. And thinking back to what Lise was saying earlier, it's like, if you get treated respectfully, it's like, wow, this is amazing, this is a great thing,
Yeah.
Where that should be the baseline.
Yeah. I went through the Dutch healthcare system to get officially diagnosed as trans. And I don't know exactly what the process is like in the UK, but in the Netherlands, you have to go through, aside from all the waiting times, which are up to similar to in the UK at this point, it's a minimum 6-month process. And there's a number of appointments, and the whole process of getting diagnosed is very invasive. They basically want you to turn your life upside down and inside out. And the worst part for me is at the end, the panel discussion where, so your individual psychologist at some point concludes that you are trans enough, and then the rest of the team gets to basically vote on that. So it's literally like a group of cis people sitting in a room deciding if I'm trans enough to receive the healthcare that I desperately need. And that's not even talking about how difficult it is. Like, there's only a few psychologists that I know of that actually believe that non-binary people exist and should receive treatment. Like, there's non-binary phobia, I guess, within the team of trans psychologists, and this is a trans like patients group in the Netherlands where someone published a really detailed review. They had like contacts within the organization, and basically the argument that they'd gotten when they'd asked why are there no trans psychologists was that they would be prejudiced and therefore wouldn't be able to provide like the right kind of care. And like how much I wish that I could speak to a therapist or a psychologist who actually understood what I was going through. Like, I don't care how many years they've spent in university learning about this stuff from textbooks. They will never completely understand what it is like, what the experience of trans being like, no matter how many patients they speak to. And I'm saying patients because I don't see myself as a patient when it comes to trans stuff.
Yeah, I think it's because I'm also a disabled person with a chronic illness. And so I think I equated a lot in my head to like going to see doctors for my chronic illness, or like when I move and have to see a new doctor, and that new doctor has to like give me the side eye about if I'm really actually disabled or if I'm just experiencing some sort of like akin to in the 1800s being diagnosed with hysteria or something. And it's the same concept of like cis people don't want trans people to treat trans people because they feel that they, as cis people who have gone to school, are the experts on the trans experience and the only ones who can look at it objectively or something. And it's just very like frustrating because I have learned more about myself and about my experience from talking to other non-medically trained trans people than any therapist I've ever had to speak to.
Yeah.
I think I saw an interesting poll somebody had started on Twitter today, and it was a trans person started up on a poll on should cis people have rights.
Yeah, I saw that.
And there was actually a comment suggesting that maybe cis people should have to, spend 2 years and things like that before they got any rights. And I just thought it was interesting to reverse it back round. And like, if we were asking cis people to go through what they ask us to go through, would that be the thing that actually let them see how chronically wrong it is? It's.
And kind of maybe following on from that slightly, we did have a couple of points I want to make. One of them is we had a comment through on our Q&A from Sarah. She just said she wanted to mention that there has been a push in the private sector in the UK, and she mentions it as a growing trend here in the UK for employers to include gender reassignment in their private medical insurance. She does mention this is subjective to the sector, insurer, etc., but there is that push. And she just wanted to mention that there seems to be a growing support in recognition, at least from the workforce as well. I mean, what are people's thoughts on that? Do you think that's the way forward, or is it more broader than that?
Well, I think when it comes to healthcare provision, I think it's quite a complex issue, particularly for Scotland. I think, as we've been talking about, particularly with going through the NHS, in recent years, the hurdles have been going, but I think I didn't know that Scotland is, like, in terms of like non-binary medication and just in terms of policy, they are slightly better than England when I'm saying that, England is like, like crashing through the floor, is going to the core of the universe. But that's why I think when it comes to private medication, because they are going out with and the NHS system, they tend to be slightly more like, from recent studies, I think Ruth Pierce, the medical historian, did a really good study of that, and it was that actually private care tends to be more inclusive of, you know, like if you are non-binary, they will treat you for being non-binary per se. But however, that becomes a very sticky thing when we are basically very economically disadvantaged as an identity group. And a lot of that comes down to employment discrimination, and also the fact that we have to pay for our transition to even be recognized as the gender that we are in society. So I think if employers are willing to pay for that, great. I would be all for that. But I think this comes again, like I'm very much advocating that being trans should be part of universal healthcare, and there should be much stronger activism just to kind of push for better reforms within the NHS, so there is actual education at each level, so you don't go for this horrific like gatekeeping each time you go and have an appointment, and as Emma said earlier, you know, like get, you know, potentially sexually assaulted, like, or even just like have your identity constantly questioned because you just don't know what trans is. Because that's basically what the situation is. But I think I'm careful not to homogenize all surgical practitioners, because some are actually really cool and like are on our side, recognize trans issues, are up to date. But by and large, there's more training to be done, and it needs to be a much stronger public conversation in that regard. That is hopefully on our side for once.
Yeah, I think it would be really great if GPs got more sort of responsibility. For example, so I originally have testosterone through the Dutch clinic, but because of COVID, I can't access that right now. So I spoke to my GP here and said, can I get a bridging prescription? And she said, yes, that's fine. Get me a letter. So I got a letter from the Dutch clinic. But she's now on holiday, and because it took so long to get the letter, I've run out of the gel. And because so my GP was willing to do a bridging prescription, which is basically on their own responsibility, which is so that means that for that reason she didn't put that on the record. So we in the notes for that appointment that we had, she noted some hay fever medication that I got, but she didn't note that she promised to give me a bridging prescription. And because she's on holiday now, I have to meet with a different GP to see if they are willing to prescribe testosterone to me based on this letter without getting the Scottish gender clinics okay. And if they had more ability to do that, she would have been able to put that on the record, because I guess if she put it on the record now, she would be liable or whatever. It's little things like that. So even though I have a GP who is willing to help out, there's things in the system that make it difficult to be able to do that.
Totally. And one of the questions as well, and maybe leads on well from this, we've spoken quite a lot about the myths around the trans community, assumptions that people make about trans people, and how that's impacted on all of your lives in some way. So the question that I have is, I suppose it's taking a step back, but also hopefully taking a step forward, in that what do you think the main myths are that surround the trans community, and how do you think that we can all work together to overcome them?
Oh, well, I think that, sorry, I'm talking a wee bit quite a bit, I'm so sorry. But I think this comes down to it comes down to a question of actual patriarchy and patriarchal stereotypes. Because if you actually look at the way that trans people are treated based on where they identify in the gender spectrum, as a trans fan, I tend to be read as predatory and read as too manly to be a woman, even though I'm not even a woman, but I'm non-binary, but it's almost read as an excess. It's something that is monstrous. It has to be annihilated. It's almost like Frankenstein. It's you have to kill the evil monster at the end of the movie because it's not like the rest of us. And I think that always underpins this really public discussion of trans women is, once again, these predators that need to be pushed away from society when there's, we're just being who we are in public space. And I think on the other side of it, we also have trans masculine people. So people assigned female or identifies as male or masculine presenting, they tend to be read as infantilized because they're not manly enough to be men. And it's is once again based on this patriarchal understanding. Like,
Yeah.
sorry, what?
Oh, the uwu soft boy thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'm very palatable as a non-binary person for a lot of people because I'm white and I'm transmasculine. So you know, because the patriarchy is more acceptable to move towards masculinity than away from it. And I guess I'm lucky in that sense, which is again a really messed up thing to to say. I think it's very important. Where did I read? I read somewhere. We don't owe you androgyny, and in the same vein, we don't owe you whiteness, and we don't owe you able-bodiedness and all the other intersections. It's and that's an issue of representation as well, because even when we get representation, it very often is the most palatable version of a trans person that they can find. So
No, I
I
think
think yeah.
not just saying like that's really, really interesting, because I think the whole like there's this whole thing in non-binary communities that the aesthetic of non-binary is being androgynous, and like as someone who like is the whole aesthetic of androgyny is okay. This is like content warning. I'm going to say the word pedophilia, but it's actually based on like not exuding secondary sex characteristics. It's about looking like this almost like surfaceless child, and I just think that's once again deeply patriarchal. Like we should be allowed to like let our bodies grow into whatever we want to and see and identify and feel comfortable in our own bodies. And I think this is the idea that once again, like even though we're non-binary, we're still kind of squished and shoehorned into that patriarchal model that puts men over women, but also like the adult over the child is also like a power dynamic, and it's just really gross. I hate it.
I think that was something I noticed a few years ago. Again, a really important point that Lise has picked up on. It's like if you go from femininity to masculinity, that's seen as, oh, well, you're going up the scale, so like people understand it, and that's a good thing. But going from masculinity to femininity is really frowned upon. And I think it really shows, the more non-passing a trans woman is, the more directly she will get hate. Yeah. If you're fortunate like me that you can kind of get away with it, it's okay. But if you still look masculine but dressed as a woman, you are going to get a horrendous time of it, because society just, even though like a lot of the ones I've seen lately, one of the myths around the gender critical movement is that it's all just about clothes, and that trans people are following stereotypes. And I'm like, I actually think we're trying to dismantle the stereotypes. We're trying to create a world where people can just be whoever they are, where even if it is a guy that wants to wear a dress, that's fine. He can get on with it and go and live his life, and nobody's giving him hate. I mean, I think for me, I dress reasonably androgynous. I pretty much dress the same way now as I did before I transitioned, because it was never about clothes. It was about how I felt in the body I was living in. Just didn't fit. So I hate this whole idea where they feel like they're calling themselves gender critical, but to me they're not being critical of gender at all. They're actually looking for two very distinct. If you're a man, you dress masculine. If you're a woman, you dress feminine, and that's the society they want to live in. And I'm like, how is that being critical of gender? That's shoehorning people into two very distinct boxes.
Yeah, and Luke, I was wondering if you wanted to, or if you had any feelings on that as well.
So just from like before, I was thinking like it's kind of strange. I shouldn't have to feel grateful that I'm transmasculine rather than the other way around. But also, I do get treated a lot better now than I used to be treated, just because I present more as male. Like I just in general was walking down the street, like people would be like, "All right, mate, like how you doing?" Like people just interact with you a lot easier. But then also at the same time, I think being trans, like as soon as people know, like sorry, I have a blue hand from work. Like especially, so I was thinking more. So my line of work, like it's unusual to have a man working in a nursery. And then I feel like when people find out I'm trans, they're like, "Oh, that makes sense why you work in a nursery," rather than just being like, oh, you're a guy that works in a nursery. So I think it's kind of, there's weird two sides. Like I will be treated better in general, and then other times people do the whole, oh, I'll ask someone else to help me lift this heavy thing then because you're trans. It's like I'm not very big, so I probably couldn't lift it, but it's more the fact that it's, you know, I'll assume that you can't do that because you're trans. You're not, almost, you're not a real man kind of thing. It's kind of, I don't know, it just seems to be in different situations I'm grateful and shouldn't have to be, and then I'm, you know, kind of upset about it when also shouldn't have to be. Like, it's just all little things that kind of make you feel odd and like, again, just marginalized, and not as if you're kind of taking away the fact that, like, we don't actually accept it. Like, people will say, oh, we accept this, we think that's great that you're trans, you know, live your best life and whatever, but then also they do little things that are like, tell you that they don't kind of fully get it. Like, it's not that, I don't really know what I'm trying to say, but yeah, like,
Aye. I used to volunteer with an LGBT organisation on a trans support group, and it was the two trans women who were expected to go down and get the chairs downstairs every month and bring them upstairs. And I'm like, am I the only person that sees this? Does this feel weird that it's the trans women that are expected to go and do the heavy lifting? And I'm like, I'm not any more capable of lifting anything than anybody else stood in the room, you know? I'm like, what's going on here? And I think there was only one person that got it. There was a non-binary person volunteered, and I'm like, this is weird. And they went, microaggressions, and I went, thank you. Somebody's actually saw it.
Yeah, and go on, Lisa. Was it Lisa or Rue? Sorry.
Sorry. I think another like aspect, sort of going off of what everyone said, is that a lot of the like attitudes towards like transmasculine or transfeminine people is like treating it like an internalized homophobia or an internalized lesbophobia, where like, oh, you're transitioning to male because you don't want to be seen as like a lesbian, or vice versa, like you don't want to be seen as gay, so you're transitioning to feminine. And sort of like the combined like homophobia and transphobia in that statement of your identity isn't real, you just don't want to be a different like aspect of the LGBT community. And then when people who are trans are also not straight, they receive an entirely separate like level of discrimination of like, well, why did you transition if you were still going to be gay, essentially? And that sort of thing is just a compounding of the like lack of understanding of trans people.
Yeah, I found that when I actually, so when I first came out to the people at work, and the first thing they asked me was, so are you straight or gay then? And I was like, that's nothing to do with it. Like, no way, I still don't even know. I know I'm trans, but I don't know. But I had like a male partner at the time, and they were like, oh, right, so like you're straight. And I was like, no, that's so wrong. But like, I don't know, just, I guess part of it's just in education, I suppose. People are kind of ignorant to things. People kind of group sexuality and gender into the same thing, and it's still a problem. And like, people don't even realize they're doing it, which I think is almost the bigger issue. Like, if people realized they were doing it and knew that that was something that was, you know, incorrect and not good, then they would kind of, I guess you wouldn't want them to think about it more, because the point is like they wouldn't have to think about it, because it should just come as like a given that you don't know. Like, if you look at a cis guy, you don't know if they're gay or straight or whatever, and you wouldn't ask. Whereas then, because you're trans, people ask you, and they're like, oh, so are you gay, are you straight? And I'm like, it's not, they're not even slightly, I mean, they're, I guess you could say they're linked, but they're not. It's separate things.
I think I've had some weird assumptions over the years where I've had people assuming I'm a lesbian, which I've thought was interesting, and I've had people assuming I'm straight. You know, I've walked into a bank with my partner's bank account to pay money in, and it says Ms. on it, and they're like, him, and I'm like, it's a woman, you know, like, hello, you've just assumed heterosexuality again. But I do find it interesting when people assume I'm gay, and I'm like, did you just assume I'm gay because you could tell I'm trans? Like, well, you know, kind of what's going on there? Because normally you wouldn't assume I was a lesbian. But I found it interesting. One of the things we were talking about earlier was about if you make a big deal out of something, it comes across big. And I was on a counselling course years ago, and I decided to come out to the group as being trans. And I just kind of added on at the end, so that means I'm also a lesbian. Just like it was an afterthought, it just happened to be. And there was a lesbian woman in the group come up to me and she was like, I can't believe how you just did that. You just said you were a lesbian like it meant nothing. And I'm like, well, it should mean nothing. You know, in the same way me being trans should mean nothing.
Yeah. One worrying thing I've been noticing a lot lately in the discourse around she who shall not be named is the argument specifically for trans boys, I think specifically, is that they're framing it as an attempt to get away from womanhood, and that is really, really problematic as well, because I mean, there's a reason we say trans woman from someone who's transitioning from female or male to female. We're going towards something, not away from something. I mean, personally, there are aspects of living life as a woman that I want to get away from, but it's not that I'm trying to escape that. It's that I'm trying to go towards living life as a non-binary person, and the validation and recognition that I get from that. It's not trying to escape the other thing, which I mean, the simple existence of trans women proves that point, because why would you leave the privilege of being a man to go and be a woman and to go and be harassed and beaten up and all of those things? So that's, I think, an argument that I've been noticing a lot lately in the discourse around trans people.
Yeah, and sorry, go on, Teddy. You're probably about to say what I was going to ask anyway.
Oh no, I don't think I was. I've got something quite complex to say, but I think this is really interesting when we talk about trans youth, because I think I always think it's really tricky topic, because this is one. So if I'm going to get my devil's advocate hat on, I do think there's a problem that we do as trans adults, in that we kind of assume what the child, we kind of can create our own trans child because we think we were, because we're trans kids when we're younger, but we're not the masters of our own past, really. The only people who can speak for trans kids right now are actual transgender children. And this is what I find really annoying in this discussion, is just even right now, I feel as a trans adult, I'm always told, okay, when could you tell that you were trans? And then you'd have to think, okay, I have to think of the most gender stereotypical thing I did when I was a kid. I know that's really problematic to begin with. And then, because we're always trying to say that it's not about gender stereotypes, it's about identity and how you see yourself in the world. But we still create this child in the past as this symbol of, yes, we were definitely trans. And we call this the colonization of childhood. It's actually using the child as almost like a puppet for your political viewpoint. And as this is what I'm actually seeing with these gender critical activists, is they are using the child as a colonized object. They're using it as a weapon to hurt trans people. I'm going to this is why we also call this the fascism of childhood, in the sense, whenever you want to make something like a minority group look evil, you pose them as a threat to children. That was true with the Hitler generation. It was true with Section 28, with gay people. It's just, you want to hate someone, just say, oh, think of the children. That's their optic. And this is the thing that's kind of been used and discussed as this constructed ideal of childhood. So this is why, even with detransitioners, I think, detransitioners are a real thing. People who transition and then come back and use medical assistance to, detransition themselves back to their assigned gender. I think that's a valid narrative, and there are people out there who experience that, but these activists cherry pick those who have particularly, negative experiences, and kind of who've had that negative experience clustered towards their ideology, and then weaponize their experience to hurt trans people. And detransitioners are even then a 0.% tiny minority of an already 0.% tiny minority, and it's blown out of proportion to weaponize against us. So so basically what I just want to say, going back to the original point, is just like, in these discussions about transgender children, even as trans adults, we don't know the answers to it. If we want to know the answers, listen to kids, like listen to the kids who are being affected by this, really.
Definitely, and there is a big push right now as well, Teddy, in terms of the UNCRC, and certainly in Scotland at least, and the rights of children and making sure their voices are heard. It leads quite well into another question I was hoping to ask, was around how can we make sure those voices are represented of trans children, but also more broadly, what do you think organisations can do to ensure that trans people are always represented and included in their work? For example, we often hear with LGBT organisations forgetting about the T, right? So this type of thing, would be keen to hear about that.
I think that's an interesting one for me, having worked with quite a few LGBT organisations. And generally, even in an LGBT organisation, it's LGBT people that are taking the lead. You know, you generally get cis people running a trans support group, and you'll have trans volunteers to kind of, well, you can come and help out. And I think it kind of goes back, I think it was Teddy brought it up earlier. It's a kind of, to me, it's an infantilization of the entire community, where you're not trusted to be in charge of your own life and responsible for your own actions, like you need looked after all the time. And I think even in a sense, partly I think the patriarchy plays a part in a really strange way, because most of the trans folk I know that are higher up in organisations are trans masculine, and I'm like, how did that work? That feels like we've switched it somehow, but it's still the patriarchy, because it's still men that are getting to be at the top. But then they come out with the narrative and say trans women are still men, and I'm like, we certainly don't get treated like men anywhere, even within LGBT organisations. You know, we just need to elevate trans people, you know, have us in the conversations, have us running our own groups, you know, have us at the top of trans organisations, have us in health boards, have us on, you know, company boards, have us in politics. And I think that's the only way we'll change it, is by actually giving trans people a seat at the table to be in charge of their own narrative.
Yeah, I think so. My employer recently put out a new trans training, like on the staff website. You can go and do this, I don't know, half-hour training. And I went through it, and the whole thing was about the law, so the Equality Act, and it takes you through all of that. And by the end of it, so I put myself in the shoes of a cis person and tried to think about, you know, what would I've learned. And by the end of it, I knew about the legal position of trans people. I still had no fucking clue how to treat a trans colleague in a nice way. So I think it's really important that employers or organizations take a step beyond the like legal requirements and actually think about what their trans employers or employees might need and how they can help to provide that. And that goes for volunteer organizations and hobby groups and anything. And the only way to find out about that is to talk to trans people. And sometimes that can be difficult if you don't have any like openly trans people in your group. Like, how do you make it accessible to make people feel welcome to join? And I think all too often people stop there. They're like, oh, we don't. And sometimes that can come from a point of fear or like being afraid to get it wrong, which is really understandable. And that's an important part of being an ally is making mistakes. Like, you're going to make mistakes, but don't let that stop you from doing the work and trying your best to do this. So I think it's really important that if people are in that kind of situation, is to reach out to a trans organization like Scottish Trans Alliance or one of many other groups, to see if you can get some insight and advice, and to then also pay the people who provide that for you for their labor. I think that's really important to take it beyond the like sort of very factual law statistics kind of aspect of it.
Yeah, I agree a lot, especially with the bit about paying people for their labor, because I think a huge part of the problem with like organizations who bring in trans people to talk about trans experiences and things like that is that if you're essentially holding a training for your workforce on how to interact with trans people, which the fact that we have to have these trainings is of course a sign of how society is not up to speed where it needs to be. But if you ask a trans person to come in and talk about their experiences and then don't like give them some sort of payment for that emotional labor and the like intellectual labor that they're going through, at the end of the day, you have disenfranchised that trans person and not given them a position of power or any like recompense for the like suffering that they've had to endure to understand the experience that is their life essentially.
We get to be grateful for having the opportunity to be allowed to educate others rather than, yeah.
I think as well on that one, often if you're the only trans employee, you become the right. Well, you could come and educate everybody about trans issues. Like you might have just started your transition, you might know nothing about the rest of the community, but suddenly you're propelled into this place where you're supposed to educate everybody.
I think it's a completely different side of like education, but I just thought of while you were all talking, so in like I teach a preschool classroom, and in the classroom my employer came down one day and handed me like this bunch of books to put in the story corner, which is normal, and I looked through them, and she then asked me about it later and was asking me if I was like happy with them, which I was, because there was a lot of I can't remember. So one of them's like Daddy, Papa, and me, and then there was Mommy, Mama, and me, and there was stuff like that. And there is a lot of there's a lot of like basic level sort of education about that. You know, there are gay people and there are lesbians and there are bisexual people and stuff, but there is I have not seen to this day any books aimed at younger children or most people about anything to do with trans. Like we have a great story and we have things about disabled people, we have things about black people, we have things about lots of different walks of life, but I've seen nothing about trans people. There's no education. We're supposed to talk to the children about things. We talk to them about anything. Like we educate them on like death, which most people can't get their head around, that we talk to 4-year-olds about like what being dead means and things like that. But we're not allowed to tell them about trans people, and that people can be born in the wrong body, and people can feel like they don't feel like a girl or a boy, or that they they fall somewhere. There's nothing. There's just no education on even that level. Like,
well,
yeah.
I think there might. I'm sorry to because I do agree to. No, I do agree to a point. Like I think they're like trans books are less popular than LGBT like youth education. That's been a thing. I will say that there's quite a good amount of literature on like gender non-conforming children. Like so basically it would basically be a wee fairy tale narrative about a kid like going about wearing makeup or wearing a dress. It wouldn't put the word on it. Like it would just be like this, here's a kid, like we're not going to give them gender pronouns or anything, or like explicitly this is a trans person. It would just be like, here's gender nonconformists. I think there is also I Am Jazz, which was that famous book about Jazz Jennings, the first, I think she was the first trans child to be documented on television. And that was, I can't remember when it came out, but so there is like a small, like, small, but bare level of trans education. And I think particularly at this current standpoint, when we are educating trans, like, the youth and all young people in general about LGBT issues, there is still a very much a stigma around trans issues, particularly in this current political climate where they're wanting to push the idea that being trans is now gay conversion therapy. And I'm just like, I don't understand that whole narrative. Like basically in my personal life, like I don't know like any, like I think it's aimed particularly at trans men, and like all the trans men in my immediate friend group like tend to be like bi, pan, or gay men. So I find it very bizarre. I haven't seen a straight man in years, but like, yeah, like it's just I just find it quite bizarre, but that's what I mean. Like it's a icky political climate, and I think but actually more that needs to be done.
Yeah, I know there's a number of books out there, but there are so many of them are self-published because I think that's where a big issue is. They exist, people are making them, but they're not being like produced by all the big printing houses, and they're not available for schools to buy easily. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that it's really easy to sell, like once you get over the being gay is wrong, it's really easy to sell love is love. And this is the same issue that you see with Pride. It's really easy for corporations, for schools, for employers to push the love is love story, because who doesn't love love, and but the issues around being trans are a lot more complicated, and the criticism, like again, it's easy to refute homophobes shouting that it's wrong. It's a lot harder to, I think, to counter, or if you're not familiar with a trans theory, it's a lot harder to spot the problems and the in turf ideology, in gender critical ideas. If you don't know what you're looking for, sometimes it can come across really as really convincing. And so overall, I think that those two things are part of why it's so much harder to get resources for education for younger people on trans issues compared to gay, bi, pan, etc.
And on that, Lisa, as well, just quickly, Teddy, and you're probably about to say it, but everyone's mentioning resources, and there was a question in the chat actually around, if you want to learn more and want to develop, is there any good resources out there that any of you would recommend, or any good places to go as well? Sorry for cutting you off there, Teddy.
Oh no, that's fine. Like I'll come back to my point later, but I think Emma might be good at this because I think SDA's got some good stuff. Is that?
I would obviously recommend the Scottish Trans Alliance website against others, mainly because they're a trans-led organisation. They are part of the Equality Network, which covers the whole LGBT. But, I always feel they're different rather than LGBT Youth or Stonewall. Scottish Trans is specifically working on trans and non-binary issues. So I generally, that's the place I would signpost people. If you want to go and learn stuff, go talk to them, go look up their website. But there's definitely some good books, depending what age range you're looking at. There's definitely some good books out there now. I started off, I'm trying to remember her name now. I forget. I should get shot. I forgot somebody's name from years ago that I started off reading things like Gender Outlaw, Kate Bernstein.
Yeah.
But now you've got like Juno Roche, Meg John Barker, and people like that writing stuff. So it is possible to pick up a lot more trans informative books that are there if people want to go and learn stuff.
Yeah, I think similar to what you're saying, Emma, it's really important that whoever you go to for research, and make sure they're actually trans people, or trans-led resources. And my main answer is always YouTube. There's so many YouTubers out there that are sharing their experiences and having really nuanced conversations. So listen, just find trans people and listen to them. They're everywhere. Find them and listen to them. Read about their experiences, read their blogs, watch their videos, listen to their podcasts. It's really not hard to find resources today to learn about these. It's not like 30 years ago when you had to go to library and find like the one book
the one
out there.
So,
find it, basically.
Sort of on the same vein, I agree on like podcasts and YouTube videos and like forum sites that are run by trans people, because so often trans people don't get large platforms like publishers or university like publications and like the big platform things that you're kind of used to seeing for cis issues. It's all like the trans community is a lot like smaller because they don't have that platform. So it is really important to look for like independent trans creators and like learn from their experience, because like they like a publisher might not be publishing a trans person's book, but they might have it on like Gumroad or a similar platform where you can toss a trans person a few dollars and get to read an actual trans experience, as opposed to reading a book about a doctor who studies, like from a doctor who studies trans people.
Yeah. And when you find these people, pay them.
Yeah. No, like I think I've got like a wee list. If there's people who are watching who want like a wee list, I think if you want for internet resources, My Generation by Fox and Owl is a very lovely resource of a very diverse range of interviews with transgender people. If you want to know like the broader spectrum of the trans community, if you want to read like Emma suggested Kate Bornstein's Gender Outlaw, that's a very good book. Also, there's that if you find books a wee bit heavy, also there's a comic book literally called I think it's it's both by men, John Barker, and it's made by John Barker. There's Gender, a graphic guide, and also Queer History, a graphic guide. They're both fantastic resources. They're a fantastic academic, and they're both really good books. Let's see, also Whipping Girl by Julia Serrano is also a very good book if you want to understand how misogyny like clicks in with transphobia. And I don't know, I nearly suggested ContraPoints, but like she's like if of the left wing, and like I'm left wing, but like just 2 heads up, she's kind of a spicy figure, but she does have really fun and entertaining and educational videos. So yeah, if you're interested.
Luke, I think was gonna.
Sorry, I'm not cutting anyone off. Luke, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I was gonna, not even slightly as interested as any of you guys were saying, but I know that there's only like what 0.6 of the population or something, 0.06 that are trans people. But if you have the luxury of just going and talking in person to a trans person or on Zoom to a trans person, do that first. Like I would try and find actual trans people rather than, you know, reading. The worst one I have found is like, no disrespect, but the NHS website. It's horrendous.
Yeah.
Speak to a trans person.
Funny that, I tell trans people that as well. Go find trans people and talk to them.
For anyone specifically in Aberdeen who is trans and who wants to learn more, Grampian Tea Folk is a Facebook group. So if anyone is wanting those resources, but that's, I think, trans people only.
Brilliant. No, thanks for that, Lisa. And I mean, just while you're speaking there as well, like I recently watched, and I'm sure everyone here probably has seen it or heard of it, but I recently watched Disclosure, and that really opened my eyes, especially to trans history. I thought it was really good. Obviously, I'm not a trans person, though, so I'd be keen to hear if you think it's good as well, or if it's something we should recommend.
It's banging. I love it. I'm so sorry I completely forgot to recommend it, but like it was. For people who aren't aware, it's a documentary about the history of like media representation of trans people, and it's a very heavy history. We've not got a lot of good representation over the years, but it's also quite beautiful. Like there's even discussion about like how, you know, we actually look at media and also form our identity even when it's not about trans people. Like there was even this really beautiful scene where they like I had a trans woman actually saying like how they actually identified as like saw Bugs Bunny as like this trans icon because it's a cartoon that's not like embodied in material reality, so you can kind of like create your own fantasy and dream world because it's a cartoon bunny. But yeah, I really loved it. And if you're also interested in LGB documented history, I also recommend Celluloid Closet. But yeah.
And we had this question come in there, and it's kind of on the similar theme around TV and film representation. I'll just read it out. So it says, do you think there should be more accurate trans representation on TV and film? I only know, this is Sarah who asked us, I only know one, which is Nicole Maines, who plays as Dreamer on Supergirl.
Oh.
I think that there should, I don't know if this is actually answering that question or not, now that I'm thinking about it, but I think there should be more trans people kind of on TV, like as trans people. Like this might be a really bad way to put it, but like you wouldn't have a white person play a black person's role in the same way that you wouldn't have, like, I don't think that we should have as many cis people playing trans roles and things. I think some can be fairly accurate, but I don't think you're going to get the same like thing from it as you would from, you know, having a trans person represent a trans person.
Yeah. And just like the argument that, you know, it's acting, and the whole point of acting is, but the main issue is that it reinforces the idea that a trans woman is a man in a dress. Because if you see Jared Leto or whoever playing a trans woman, then that reinforces the idea that a trans woman is a man in a dress. I think it's incredibly important to have representation of trans stories written, directed, played by trans people. But I think it's also really important that we get stories where trans people just exist and it's not about them being trans. The same thing with the bury your gays trope, which is that in a lot of movies, being gay means you're expendable, you die, or the whole movie is about the drama and how difficult it is and how painful and how everyone hates you. And trans movies way too often focus on those things. And I just want casual representation. I just want a movie with a trans character in it that just does other things. That's the love interest, but the fact that they're trans is not relevant. Or I call it, you know, I want casual trans representation in movies and TV and everywhere else. Where it's not about the struggle.
I grew up with Soldier's Girl and Boys Don't Cry.
Yeah.
Probably two of the most dramatic films you can watch. And I think that is what we need to get away from. It shouldn't be sensationalised. Shouldn't say this, but actually got into Hollyoaks for quite a while because they had trans characters in Hollyoaks. You know, we've got a trans woman playing the head teacher at a school, and she's just the head teacher at a school. They make a bit out of the trans part of her history, but her main role is she's a teacher in a school, and I think that's the kind of thing we want to see. You know, show trans people in normal everyday roles, especially involving kids, because, you know, I think that is where we need to change it. Take away the whole myth that we're a risk to children in some way.
No, I think that's a really good point that you made, Emma. Like, is Hollyoaks that actually had the better representation than probably the past 2 decades of cinema. Like, honestly, like, I think it's a genuine thing, because I think it's also the way like narratives work. Like, you have to have this big payoff, and when you have like a single trans character in the focus of the movie, they have to die dramatically. And I think it's ultimately about that sort of era of movies like Boys Don't Cry. It's almost like taking a trans person, having them suffer for a cisgender audience, and just so they can kind of emote something towards this thing they don't understand. And I think we need to get beyond that, because I think we should be beyond that stage at this point now, where you just have this casual representation. And I think television is actually, I think, a stronger medium for trans people, because it's about long-form narrative. It's about just showing our lives as day to day. That's what television does. It's the sort of the medium of the everyday life. And I think that's really important. Like, some of the best TV shows right now, like, I think we talk, people, I don't know if we mentioned Pose yet. Like, it's about the New York ballroom culture, and it was about trans women of color. And it was, I think it's a very radical show. Like, it's also written by a trans woman of color, Janet Mock. And yeah, just watch Pose. Like, it's an absolutely amazing show. But like, at the same time, behind all this media representation, I'm just like, I feel like it's almost like we've opened a Pandora's box in the past like 7 years. Like, even though we have shows like Pose, trans women of color are still dying horrifically. And I still come to this point where, like, it just almost feels like we've ripped open the wee box, and like, we're almost like seeing, like, particularly, you know, ballroom culture that was particularly queer, like some trans, some gay, cis gay, sorry, like identities all amalgamated doing this sort of thing, and like doing death drops and tongue pops, and it's all this sort of commodification of a Black culture. But how many like tongue pops away are we from actually recognizing that trans people of color are dying and like really need support right now? Like, it's, yeah. I don't know. I just think media is just such a really complex kettle of fish when it's also tied to reality.
Yeah. And if you're a cis person wanting to watch movies or shows with trans characters in it, make sure that you do your due diligence and check whether, you know, check what the trans community thinks about certain movies. One example is Girl. It's that came out a year or two ago. horrible. There's plenty of articles out there that explain all of the issues with this movie. It's gotten all these prizes from basically cis audiences, and the whole trans community is like, this is horrible. It's an incredibly invasive, voyeuristic, really messed up movie. That go read some articles about it. It's horrible. Don't watch it, please. In general, if you're going to watch something, please check, do some Googling, find out what the trans community has to say about movies. Or if you've watched something and you're like feeling a little bit about this, do some reading and think about what the issues are, because that's also a good way to learn.
Yeah, definitely. Go on.
I think what's really important, and like why Pose is such like a powerful show for the trans community, especially for trans women of color, is that because it was written by a trans woman and like performed by trans and gender nonconforming people, like it allows us to control our own narrative, which a lot of the time, even media that has a trans actor playing a trans character or a trans actor involved is still written and produced by cis people. And so will always be seen through their lens. And I think it's really important to like have spaces open for trans people to build and create their own narratives to be seen the way that they are, as opposed to the way that society views us. And so I think like the media that contains trans people is more meaningful if it's created by and for trans people, and not by cis people for a cis lens where you just get a glimpse into what cis people think being trans is.
Yeah, definitely. So we're running out of time. We're 5 minutes over technically, but there is one really good question, and one that I would like to end with as well. A good question came through on the chat, and I think ties this together really well, and we're kind of moving to a space of the conversation where it's really about, you know, what cis people can do to help. And the question that came through was quite complex, but they reworded it for me, thankfully. Basically, it was about how do we get people who might pertain to be allies and trans allies, but they have quite a passive role. So the example that they give is perhaps a family member who is outwardly accepting of you being trans, but perhaps inwardly still has transphobic tendencies, and that they might not be an active trans ally and actually, you know, campaign for trans rights or stand up with trans people when they're, you know, wanting to get more rights and actually be accepted into wider society. So I kind of read the question as what is a good ally, and really what, you know, what your ideas are on that.
Listening.
I think also if you're a good ally, I think that whole mentality of like on the front you're supportive of trans people, but on the inside you're still a wee bit ambiguous. I think that can be sometimes quite a dangerous position to be in. Like I've known over the years, like I've had like people close to me who like had that position, but then the second they get that wee spore and like read a Spectator article or like the New Statesman, a Helen Lewis thing, like they're quite easy to radicalize towards the opposition. And I think that can be quite dangerous for trans people. And I'm not quite sure how, like, you go about, like, you know, like, I think actually, you know, go about, like, actually getting people involved and becoming active in, like, resisting cis normativity and resisting cis patriarchy. And I find that quite difficult because I think that's also down to the individual. Like, so from my experiences, it's just by being around trans people and knowing our experiences and our difficulties that you can kind of want to empathize and be on our side. But yeah, I think it's a bit tricky.
I have a lot of thoughts around allies at the moment. Probably because I feel like they're not doing enough, and I don't mean that to sound harsh. I think it's just my disappointment sometimes as a trans voice when you're trying to challenge the damaging rhetoric that's going on just now. You're looking around and saying, where are all these people that are saying they're allies? You know, they all seem to have hidden the coal bunker somewhere. You know, I think sometimes it's not just about saying you're an ally. Yeah. An ally is a doing thing. You know, you have to be active, you know, whether it's donating to trans charities, whether it's elevating the trans people you know, in the organisations you're in. Do you have power to go and talk to people and say, right, we should pay some trans people to come in and do training for us? Or, you know, to me, it's all about elevating trans people. So how can you do that?
Yeah.
And you can't do it by being silent. You actually have to do something to elevate trans people.
I think that comes into the whole idea of like performative activism, where you kind of put your name out there like, I'm an activist, but then push comes to shove, you're not actually going to help us when we are in crisis. You aren't going to help us when we're actually in an issue. And I think that comes down to like, another thing I really hate sometimes is just like when you're tone policed, is just because sometimes like allies mess up because they're not trans, they don't know our experiences. And whenever we like as trans people address that, it's almost like this, you know, like we're automatically the cancelled ones. Like we're the ones who are like being irrational and being needy, and just like, okay, this is another thing about being a trans ally. You have to also understand institutional structures. We're reacting this way because we are being abused right now, and if you're wanting to be allies to us, we can take away your ally card because we are ultimately the community being affected. Like I'm taking that back because you know it's contingent on our opinion. So it's just. So I think, you know, if you're going to be an ally, I think it's also about unlearning cis privilege. And that is quite a long-term process, but like, just take it with a pinch of salt. Like when we call it out, it's just like, you know, like what, you know, when cis folk act like that, it's just like, oh God, sorry, cis people. Sorry, I do apologize to all the cis people in the audience.
No, it's, sorry, go.
Sort of to go off of what Emma said, I think that like platforming is really important. Because people will preferentially listen to a person with power over a marginalized person. So if you're a cis person and you call yourself an ally and you have a platform, using your platform to bring attention to trans people and to let like a trans person speak on your show or like talk in your group that you are a part of, and like back them and support what they're saying, because like it's a lot easier to yell about needing rights when it's not just you yelling really loud, but 100 people yelling at reasonable volumes, because you don't have to strain yourself quite so much in terms of like metaphorically. If all of the people who call themselves allies are actually willing to stand with you in that room and talk while you talk, you don't have to yell, you can all talk at the same volume essentially.
Yeah. I think if you're trans yourself, or if you're someone who is wanting to be an ally and educating and this goes for trans allies, but for all the other kinds of allies as well, it can be really difficult when you encounter someone who has, you know, put the sticker ally on themselves and thinks that because, you know, they support trans lives, they've done the work. You're never done doing the work, and it is difficult because the more someone already thinks they're an ally, in the noun sense, the harder it's going to be to get through to them, to get them to see that no, it's never done. And if you're I don't really have any helpful advice necessarily, than to try to continue talking to them, and as always try to get support from other trans people who will understand that position. But keep reminding people that being an ally is a verb and not a noun, and you've got to keep working, keep learning, keep listening, and it's never done.
So I had a thought, and it's something my dad used to say to me when I was younger, and it was basically, if you're confused about something, ask. If you see something wrong, do something about it. That is literally the two things that make my dad kind of the person he is. And also, like, that's the best way, I think, to be an ally, is like, if you don't know something, find out about it and then do something about it. Like, if you see, don't just be silent, don't just watch the trans things, don't just learn about the trans things, like, learn about it, better yourself, and then help to better other people. It's just, I don't know.
That's really, really good advice, and certainly I've taken a couple of notes there myself, even to take away. No, that's fantastic. We've run significantly over time, but I'd just like to finish with one last question. if the attendees are willing to stay, and that'd be amazing. So yeah, the final question I'd like to ask is, and there was a couple of mentions throughout the chat there by some people who said, if this had been 30 years ago or 30 years ago, the question I'd like to ask, perhaps somewhat cliche of me, but if we were sitting 30 years into the future, what would you like society to look like, and how would you like it to feel?
Just a bunch of people that are happy being themselves. I just want there to not be, I don't want there to be any of not that I don't love this conversation. I feel like I want there to just not have the need for these conversations. I want it to just everyone to just be chill with everything. I know that's obviously unrealistic to be yeah, everyone should just accept everything. I've always I want to be green tomorrow. It doesn't work like that. But I just want everyone to be able to not have to go through anything like this. I don't want, even for my sister's age group, she's almost 14. I just don't want them to have to deal with anything that I've dealt with. I don't want anybody past them to deal with anything that they're inevitably going to have to deal with. I just want everyone to be more chill. Be more chill. Just do life better. Just be more chill.
Yeah, I think I'd just say the same. A world where people are just free to be themselves without judgment. It's hard to imagine that, but that's what I hope we get.
Similarly, I find it really difficult to think, because again, we're still fighting for such small things that I can't really picture what it would be like to get all of the major changes that I think that I would want to see. I find it really difficult to. It's not a very happy answer, but it's the way it is.
Yeah. In 30 years' time, I think I just want the abolition of imperialist, capitalist, hetero, cis, white, ableist, anthropocentric patriarchy. That would be great. If we can get that, and also I can catch the next episode of I May Destroy You, that would be fantastic. But in a realistic standpoint, I would prefer this whole really toxic public atmosphere to end, so we can actually get on to the real things that are affecting trans people, and just have a happier community lifestyle, and once again just general economic movements to the left.
In an ideal world, because this is also kind of a dour point, but trans people have much lower life expectancies, especially trans femme people. I would like a trans person who was born this year to not be worried about if they're going to make it to 30 and see 30 years from now. I want society to be at a point where we support and uplift trans people and give them the help that they need and the protection and the safety and security they need, where it's not a question of, am I going to live to see 30 years from now? It's a question of, how will the world be in 30 years? So I want the world to be at a point where trans people aren't constantly worried if they're going to see tomorrow, let alone 30 years from now.
A really, really solid but important point there, Ruth. No, thank you all so much for that. And I'm going to finish our event on that. But what I would say is, I would usually say, can we have a round of applause? But I suppose that won't really work because we can't hear the attendees. But I would like to express a very, very warm thank you to all of our amazing community champions for giving up their time tonight and allowing us a bit of an insight into trans identity as well, and how, most importantly, we can actually help in some of the challenges and struggles that trans people face in this society. What I would also like to say is we're really, really keen to hear from attendees on how tonight felt. The conversations for change are still quite new for Progress and Dialogue, but we're hoping to make them a regular event. We're most interested in if they helped you to reflect on perhaps your own assumptions, stereotypes, prejudice, and hopefully you've learned something from tonight as well, so we'd be keen to hear that. For everyone else, have a like of our social media pages. As I said, we're hoping to make these quite regular. We have a conversation for change coming up on the 28th of this month, entitled Black Lives Matter, Race in Scotland. And we will be joined by 4 people of colour and Black community champions who will tell us a little bit about their experience, and hopefully again we'll learn something there. What else did I want to share? I think that's about it. Join our mailing list. You'll get that on our website if you want to hear about more of these events. But also, if you yourself are a community champion, or perhaps you don't call yourself that, but are from a community that's seldom heard, or a cause that you're particularly passionate about, Progress and Dialogue is here to help. And we really want to make sure that we're supporting as much of the grassroots as we possibly can. So please get in touch with us, or if there's an event you'd like to see in future, please again get in touch. But for now, thank you all so much for joining, and have a lovely night, and take care in the meantime.